Hi, welcome to the EpiDoc tutorials series. The rest of the series can be found at the link at the bottom of your screen now. In today's tutorial, Charlotte Tupman from the University of Exeter is going to explain to us why we are using XML in the first place for encoding epigraphic and papyrological editions, etc. Over to you, Charlotte.
Thanks, Gary. We're going to talk to start with about what encoding XML enables us to do. So the idea is that marking up our text using XML, which stands for Extensible Markup Language because it's one of the markup languages that exists, allows us to tag or encode various different parts of our text so that we can make different kinds of assertions about those texts. And that allows us to record information about them. It allows us to define our texts in various ways. And that also then allows us to analyze them using the information that we've encoded. XML is human readable and it's computer readable as well. And that means that both humans and computers can make use of it in different ways. And we're going to have a look at some of those. So XML allows us to describe what our texts mean. It allows us to capture semantic distinctions that exist in our texts. And so there's a difference between semantic markup and renditional markup. And we've got an example here. Semantic markup, as you can see, allows us to tag what something means in any given situation. So for instance, our first example, we've got a language which is foreign to the rest of the document. That's what the foreign tag means there. The next one, we've got a title. Then in the third example, we've got an emphasis that's happening in this particular sentence. This could just belong to the 2nd century AD, or whatever it may be. And you can see that the difference between the semantic markup and the renditional markup is that in renditional markup, all of those examples, so a language that's foreign to the rest of the text, a title and an emphasis would all be encoded just with in italics element. Actually, I've realised you haven't met elements yet, so you can think of them just as tags. So we've got I just standing for italics there. Okay. So encoding in XML allows us to do a variety of things. It allows us to exchange data between different projects, and it allows us to share our text with other people. It can allow us to make the resources that we produce more sustainable. And the idea behind that is that when we encode a text, we're doing something that others can then reuse in the future and can build on for their own projects and their own purposes. We can produce various different outputs that result from the single XML file that we produce or from a set of XML files that we've encoded. And one of those examples might be that we can produce different versions of our digital edition, for instance, for different audiences. We can also exchange our data with other projects or create different kinds of outputs. So, for instance, we might want to produce a database of our text. Say we've got a database of inscriptions that we want to produce. We might want to make that available over the web. We might want to make that available as part of another database, so contributing our data to a larger project, for instance. We might also want to produce print publications resulting from those. So we might want to produce a book or a PDF that's downloadable, or an article for a journal, for instance. And so we can do a variety of things once we've actually encoded our text in XML via something called style sheets, which you'll meet later on in the workshop. Thinking about those different digital editions that we can produce, for those of us who work with ancient texts, we might want to produce a diplomatic edition, which has the text that we find on our stone, for instance, an interpretive edition, which would be the editor's version of that text, where you would expand abbreviations or you would add in the parts of the text that are missing because the stone has been damaged, for instance. And you might even want to produce an educational version of a text, perhaps for school level readers, which doesn't go into the same amount of detail that a full edition would for an epigrapher, but would give perhaps a very basic view of the text, perhaps a translation. So we can think of these digital editions that we can produce from our XML files, and we can transform those XML files using style sheets to achieve that. So you can see here that in the first part of this diagram, we've got an XML file that's being transformed via a style sheet, so that's the example XSLT, into an HTML file for display on the web. But it also allows us to choose how we filter our text and how we can enter our text in a variety of different ways. For instance, we can produce indices, so that might be of names or of places or of events that are happening in our texts. Or we can produce things like tables of contents and concordances. And so we might want, for instance, to allow people to enter the text via looking at dates. So perhaps people are interested in 2nd century texts, or people are interested in texts that are from funerary texts, or from building inscriptions, or verse text, for instance. Or we might be interested in the materials that are present in our corpus. So we might be interested in, I don't know, for instance, marble funerary inscriptions from the 3rd century AD. The point is we can narrow down, or we can allow our users to choose how they get at our texts by producing filters on those texts. And you can see that in the second part of this diagram. So we've got a corpus of XML files, and we're using indexing XSLT. So that's another type of style sheet to produce our index, our table of contents, and so on. Here's an example from a real project. So this is the inscriptions of Roman Cyrenaica, which you might have met already. And here we've got honours for Hadrian. So this is, I suppose, in some respects, it fulfills the same things that you'd expect from a print publication, in that it's got a description of the text, it's got a description of the object on which you find the text, it's got letter heights, it's got date, find spot, and so on. But you can see there's also an interpretive edition and a diplomatic edition. And so the diplomatic edition has the text that appears on the stone, and the interpretive edition has the text that the editor of this text has actually produced. So you can see that there are some areas where in square brackets where letters have been added, and those are missing on the stone, presumably through damage in this case. And then you've got things like expansions and explanations of the interpuncts, for instance, and the vacats that exist in the text. Now, the point about this is that both the interpretive and the diplomatic editions have been produced from the same XML file. Another thing that we can do, though, as I mentioned, is we can enter the text in a variety of different ways. And here you can see we've done a search for Hadrian, and on the left-hand side you can see there are dates and facets, and so we can narrow those dates down to the period that we're interested in, and then we can choose to see all the texts associated with Hadrian via where they're found, via the source repository, via the material that the object's made from, via the object type, text type, and language, and so on. So XML gives us a lot of flexibility about how we allow people to use our text and how we allow them to access them. I've talked about editing and I've talked about encoding. Editing and encoding can be thought of as the same thing, in that when you're encoding, you are making editorial decisions about how you identify parts of a text and how you represent and describe those. And it's also important to remember that not everyone is going to agree on how to encode a text, and that's fine. It's inevitable that there's scholarly disagreement and discussion about the editorial process, and that includes encoding. So it's important that when we're producing XML, we're thinking about how we record those different editorial decisions that go into it. It's worth saying that XML also makes that process quite transparent, in that if you're recording your editorial decisions with encoding, you have to be quite clear about what you're doing and how you're doing it. So there's a very fine level of detail involved. And I think some people find that uncomfortable, but others recognise that that's actually a really good thing. Another aspect of what we can do then is, I mentioned exchanging data with other projects. And when you're producing your text in XML, you have the ability to potentially to crosswalk those between different formats and different databases. So, for instance, a file that you produce, you could make available to another project, or you could contribute to another project, and essentially that would allow other people to build on the work you've done, but it would also allow other people to find your work via things like federated search. So, for instance, papyri.info, which some of you will have met and worked with already, obviously has papyri that are drawn from a large number of different databases, and to which others have contributed since the creation of papyri.info. And you can obviously search across a very large body of texts, and those federated searches, they leverage the structure and the semantics and the metadata that have been contributed each time text is produced. You can also consider the possibilities of linked open data. So in this case, I think you're probably going to talk later on about linked open data, but in this case we can just say that it allows us to create a sort of interconnected web of relationships that exist between text, between text and objects, between text objects and places, and so forth. And so if you're interested in finding various different types of archaeological objects which are associated with the same site, for instance, you can use the Pelagios. Have you heard about the Pelagios network? It would be worth having a look at that if you haven't. I've put the link there. That draws together various different types of objects depending on where they're found. And so if you are interested in a particular archaeological site, you could search for that site and find that there are coins, inscriptions, and all sorts of other types of archaeological objects relating to that site. But equally, you could search for Hadrian and find where he was mentioned in different types of objects from different sites. So basically, it's drawing together data sets in a way that allows those links between different objects to become much more transparent and discoverable. There's also the question of reuse and how we repurpose inscriptions and how XML editions of inscriptions and papyri. And here we're sort of imagining things that could be done. I mean, obviously there are examples of reuse of text in various different ways, but these are some examples. If you have a group of papyri that are published in the Duke Databank, for instance, you might have another project coming along and using that XML and building on that to display alongside their own text. So, for instance, InSlib could display the XML that they got from the Duke Databank alongside Tripolitanian inscriptions that have a relationship with those, and make those links a bit more explicit. If you have a publication of inscriptions like InSaft, which has published a couple of thousand inscriptions, you could have things like art historical projects or grammar projects that are reusing those texts and again adding their own data. So a grammar project might tag linguistics, a verse inscription project might tag the meter in those texts and use those for their own purposes. I think the point about this is that whilst we might be able to imagine some of those reuses, we don't really want always to be able to predict those, and part of the exciting thing about making our texts available in this way is that we don't really know what people are going to do in the future with our material, but we want to make it available to them for those purposes, whatever they may be, as scholarship moves forward. It's a really important point, but one that causes a lot of anxiety, I think, amongst scholars. So the concept of how we sustain our digital resources. We can think of this in terms of the locks principle. So the idea of this is that lots of copies keep stuff safe. If we have one website, which is hosted on one server, there are lots of risks associated with that. So, for instance, a disk will degrade, technology moves forward very quickly, and we would have to do a lot of updating of things like formats in order to ensure that there are that our materials are going to be sustainable in the future. They would have to be well supported. But the reality is that people who work on digital projects often work on them for a short period of time, and then they move on to other projects, or people retire, or the funding runs out. But this is really no different to the concept of one book in one library being fragile. It's susceptible to water damage or fire, for instance. One manuscript is fragile. One inscription, which could easily be damaged, is fragile. The idea behind locks is that if we have lots of copies of a digital file, if we publish openly and allow people to create copies and to reuse them for their purposes, that in itself will help our material become more sustainable, in that if people have an investment in our materials because they're using them for their purposes, those materials are therefore much more likely to be preserved and therefore again reused for future research. So it's sort of a circular thing in a way. I think that was going to be the last thing I was going to mention. I'll stop there, and perhaps we could have a chat about any points that would be that you'd like me to cover apart from that.
No, I think that's great. That's covered everything we need, I think.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the workshop.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlotte.